Welcome to Downtown Dialogues, Theatrical Outfit's brand new podcast that explores the deeper themes and questions of our work. I'm Matt Thorny, Theatrical Outfit's artistic director, and I'm recording this today in our box office at our theatre right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. Today's episode features a panel discussion hosted by the wonderful Gail O'Neill that immediately followed a broadcast of a reading of Eureka Day by Jonathan Spector. Eureka Day is a fantastic new satire that has been creating waves all over the country, and this was Atlanta's premiere of the work. The play follows what happens at Eureka Day School in Berkeley after a mumps outbreak causes the state to demand mandatory vaccinations. It turns out the parents have some conflicting views on this, and in the play, people try and sort out fact from fiction, truth from falsehood, and the play asks the question, how can you make policy when you can't agree on the science? Digging into this meaty and timely material, Gail assembled a fantastic panel that included playwright Jonathan Spector, the reading's director, January Lavoy, alongside a couple of special guests who were Dr. Saad Omer, the inaugural director of the Yale Institute for Global Health, and Hank Kimmel, an Atlanta-based mediator who is also a playwright himself. The discussion is fantastic and very timely, so I will let Gail take it from here. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for Eureka Day and for this talkback session. I'm going to get right to introducing our guests tonight so we can hear their viewpoints. First, I want to introduce the playwright, Jonathan Spector. Jonathan, where are you beaming in from?
I'm in Oakland, California.
Okay, so you wrote about the people and the place that you know best. Making good trouble, I have to say. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Also participating in tonight's conversation will be the director, January Lavoy. Hello, January.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Very, very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
We also have Dr. Saad Omer, who is the inaugural director of the Yale Institute for Global Health, as well as a vaccine specialist, and brave enough to enter the fray on what is a third rail conversation these days. Good evening, Dr. Omer.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. And finally, we have Hank Kimmel, who is an Atlanta-based attorney, mediator, and playwright. So we've covered all the bases here. Welcome, Hank.
Thank you.
All right, Jonathan, I want to start with you. I know the play was commissioned by the Aurora Theater in Berkeley. What was the impetus for the commission? What was their directive to you?
There was no directive. We had started talking about a commission, and I had pitched them an extremely vague idea about doing something around vaccines in the Bay Area. But at that point didn't know it was going to be set in a school per se, but was just, it had a few experiences of encountering people who, people I knew and people I thought were very intelligent and very well educated, who then I discovered, didn't vaccinate their children or didn't believe in vaccines, and was sort of, that experience is so disorienting. And so I wanted to sort of dig deeper into it.
January, from your perspective as a director, what is it about material on a page that jumps out and says, this will be great to animate with actors? And what was it about this play in particular?
When Matt Thorny sent me the script, I sat in an afternoon and read it and was laughing out loud and gasping out loud and read it in a single sitting. So whenever that is the experience that I have, I'm very eager to get my hands on the piece to start working on it and, help lift it into the world, because it's already there. It's ready. It's like bursting off the page. And I definitely felt that way with this play.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Omer, before you migrated to the States from Pakistan, I understand you were part of a theater company can tell me about that first, and then tell me what resonated with you about Eureka Day.
So it's really funny that there, that I'm doing this, because there are a few confluences of events. First of all, yeah. So before I migrated, we used to do usually subversive dark comedies, and the country was coming out of a dictatorship, so things that would make people laugh, but also were a little dark. And for example, we did an adaptation of Defoe's An Accidental Death of an Anarchist in Urdu, where every page had to be stamped by the censors. So we stripped it of all stage directions, because we guessed that if someone had good reading comprehension, there wouldn't be a government censor. And so we had to sort of improvise, so that was kind of our experience. I haven't done theater in ages. The other interesting, I don't know if you know, I used to live in Atlanta until a year ago.
Yes.
And it reminded me of, when the school's name was Eureka, I said, are they talking about Paideia? Although Paideia is not like that. It's very science oriented. But the first scene of, being politically correct in a good way, or that kind of stuff, or is that the Waldorf school that I used to live around the corner from in Decatur? So it will resonate from your audiences. The third thing is actually, I work on vaccines, I work on vaccine trials, I work on vaccine safety, but a third of my work is actually on vaccine acceptance, and I have done some of the work that informed some of the laws that led to tightening of exemptions. We did the first study ever to say that actually the laws that were passed in the 60s and 70s, with another Atlanta connection, I don't know if you know, Rosalind Carter was instrumental in passing these laws in the 60s and 70s, late 60s, early 70s, both as a first lady of Georgia, and then the U.S. First Lady, etc. But coming back to this, I actually evaluated the California law as well and its impact. And we can go into. I hold a more nuanced position than absolutists in terms of that. What kind of mandates should be there. So it's a coincidence that I find myself here because I have thought about a lot of these issues. And Jonathan, these conversations really resonated with someone like me who has not just looked at it. I heard the vaccine court case live there, and one of the things that came to my mind, someone should make a play about this, not overall, but the court case. It was so riveting, and so on and so forth. So I'll pause here, but it was a lot of fun to watch, and very interesting to watch the play.
Well, you bring up a very good point. If any of you at any point have a question for one another because of ideas that are cropping up, or alignment and synchronicity, feel free to jump in and cross conversate. Hank, as a mediator, how often do parties enter a negotiation with the idea that there's a small chance that I might be wrong? Because I find that without that humility, it's really hard to reach any kind of reconciliation. So is that an unusual thing for people to come in open, or do you typically have two parties coming in saying, Hank is going to show this fool that I'm right?
A mediation, by the way, Jonathan, I responded to this play first as a playwright, and I urge my colleagues from working title to attend it. I urge my colleagues who I work with as mediators to attend it, but it really spoke to me most as a parent. So I do have a daughter who goes to Paideia, and she's listening right now. So really on so many different levels. But I'd say in a mediation, the focus is on what comes next. So I was looking at this from a mediator's point of view. And to me, the negotiation, and I love Don, I love the way he reframed, but to me is what is the end game? To me as a mediator in my mind is start backwards. And his line is there are no villains. I love this about the play because I think that's true in life and mediation and in a good play. And so I think what that is people come in and they have positions versus interests. I mean, this was really just a textbook in terms of where people come up on that. But I think it's really to get them to go to the future and to think specifically. And when a mediation settles, I used to say it's a mutually satisfying agreement between both parties. And realistically, now I say it's mutually dissatisfaction. How low are you willing to go, and how high are you willing to jump up on it? So I thought it was fascinating that way, that at the end of the day, I'm going, something has to give here, because and the other thing in a mediation, when there are children involved, that's when the stakes are highest. Everything else comes down to money for most cases, except for a custody case. And here they're talking about children, but at the end of the day, it's really the survivability of the school that really, to me, ended up deciding which way they were going to go. I hope that answered your question. I'm just so excited by this play. On so many different levels. So I hope I covered your answer somewhere in there.
You did, and I feel exactly like you do. Jonathan, I have to channel Don for a second. When you opened by saying you were surprised by the fact that people who you consider intelligent did not believe in vaccinating their children, that sounded like you were villainizing parents who do not agree with your point of view. Tell me about your evolution in writing the play, because in fact you write about characters who hold an opposing view with a great deal of compassion.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to expand out on that, I mean, I think what's surprising is that living in the Bay Area, a very sort of liberal bastion, it's easy to feel like everybody has your politics and everybody basically agrees with you. So I think it was not just that it was people who I thought were intelligent, but it was people who I share a lot of the same values with, and I think that we basically agree on most of our ideas about how the world works, and so it's the idea that there is this one thing where we seem to sort of live in different realities that was so surprising. I mean, I think that's why, that's what made it an interesting idea for something to explore for a play, because, making particularly because it was a commission for a theater in Berkeley, so it was going to be a Berkeley audience who were all going to be very liberal. So it wouldn't be interesting to my mind to make a play about abortion or gun rights for that audience, where the people on the other side of the issue are, they're going to dismiss them entirely out of the gate. I think it's much more interesting if it's people who are like you in so many ways, and who you see eye to eye on most things, and which makes it all the more confounding that there's this one thing that you are so far apart on.
So tell me how you worked around that one thing that you were so far apart on and managed to write Chuzauzen with so much compassion eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of research. I did a bunch of interviews with people, both with a range of sort of people I knew or friends of friends who who didn't vaccinate their kids or felt strongly about vaccines, as well as sort of interviews with some public health people and just sort of a big range of people. So I definitely brought big pieces of that into the play, and did a lot of reading and watched documentaries and just you try and sort of consume as much as you can to bring in other people's point of view. And and there's something certainly like today they just announced they had settled with the Purdue, the makers of the OxyContin, and I feel like the arguments Chuzauzen had about the reasons to be distrustful of the pharmaceutical industry in general, they're really, I find them very compelling arguments in a lot of ways. So I feel like it's not hard to access.
Right, and then to Hank's earlier point, once you bring children into the picture, then the problem just becomes intractable. There can be no higher stakes. January, I'm really interested in language and the way that language can be very passive aggressive. When people start sentences with words like actually or sorry, or they end their sentences that are really declarative, quite hostile statements in a question, things go off the rail rather quickly. Tell me about your response to the language that Jonathan chooses and how he has crafted it so carefully to really up the ante and create tension and release.
Yeah, it's an incredibly technically specific play, which is one of the reasons why it can succeed on 2 days of rehearsal, because the roadmap of the play is so finely drawn and the characters are so clear and specific, particularly in their use of language. I mean, we have this character of Mako who says very little, but says volumes with how little she says. And then she's the one who comes up with the whole human fallibility and hubris argument. There's also a sort of, I don't necessarily love this term, but in the idea of microaggressions, which anyone who has ever experienced a microaggression might argue they don't feel anything like micro when they're happening. That this idea that the offense is contained largely in the language, in the choice of word, and in the delivery. And I feel that this is a group of people who are very finely attuned to the way that they feel about their language and their sort of ownership of language, but not necessarily in tune with how their language is received.
Right.
And it to me, it leads into the larger conversation about this group of people, which is about community. And community, many times, shared culture, shared language, shared values. And yet we find when we scratch the surface that many people who consider themselves part of a community do not share values, do not necessarily even share language, do not share perspective. And so what does it mean? What is holding this quote unquote community together? And from the first conversation in this piece, what you find is like they've largely agreed on how to talk. And that's almost the thing that is actually holding this community together, is that we say things like, oh, we don't use that word. And it's like, oh, yes, that's right. Thank you for the reminder. That's who we are, which is not, when you think about it, a very strong binding for a community to hold itself together with.
Right. Hank, how true did the language ring to you as you listened to this play? And as a mediator, again, and as an attorney, are there words you hear that crop up in conversations where you think, oh, this is not going to end well?
It sounded incredibly real to me. I had a chance to read the script in advance in preparation, but just seeing this Facebook screen and all this too, and the characters just sounded very authentic. And that is true in mediation and in a play. Folks don't speak in complete sentences. And to me, what was amazing about this real life to mediation, it wasn't that's why I do mediations by Zoom, and it's more dissatisfying to me because you lose the nuance. You don't see the facial reactions. You can't really see the pauses on that. And so I think within this play, in some ways, and I think January said that when the characters were inarticulate in some ways, to me, those were the moments of the greatest articulation, is what was said between the lines. And also in this, it was like a mediation where you see parties come in, say for a divorce, and they're saying, I'm going to be on my best behavior. I'm going to be on my best behavior. And you just see that tension bubbling up. And here, there wasn't an outlet because of the language he set up for themselves actually became an impediment to their ability to communicate till the very end when it exploded. And to me, that's when cases settle. Sometimes you just have to let the steam off. So I thought the Facebook page was just absolutely amazing. It followed the trajectory of the play, followed the trajectory of a mediation. So I just was so enamored with both elements.
I just love the emojis, the well-timed emojis that would just blow everything up, the big eyes or the language. Dr. Omer, as somebody who has helped policymakers come up with policy, tell me how you balance the American right, let's say, to personal liberty and responsibility to community. How do you walk that line?
So actually, I don't take the questions of liberty lightly. Having grown up, spent a lot of my childhood under a dictatorship. Obviously, I have sort of a center-left perspective on life. I think science has corrupted me to that worldview to actually sort of value facts. And when you value facts, you end up having a certain pro-science, at least a center-left kind of a perspective. And I said that with some snark, obviously. But the questions of liberties are important for me. And the way I frame it is that it's my child's liberty to live a disease-free life. It's my liberty to send my kid to a school where they don't have to be concerned about. And that was an art subtext that I really love. That's the subtext a lot of parents use. And it is the dynamic that most parents do vaccinate. And so that's the approach. But I do, when it comes to policy, I actually don't take the perspective that I support mandates, for example, but I take a Goldilocks approach to mandates. If they are too cold, they don't work. But if they're too hot, and we showed from our work in California specifically, that when they went from the sort of really loose mandates to medium level mandates, they actually had a lot of people vaccinated. But when they went from that to eliminating all non-medical exemptions, what happened was then there was a near total replacement in 2 years, because a lot of people started sending their kids to to other charter schools that were homeschool, charter school, hybrid, and started homeschooling. So we actually showed that. We see that in data, that if you don't take that Goldilocks approach, you can have this replacement effect. So even from a pragmatic perspective, balancing them is not only that it's not contradictory, but also it's good policy as well.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for all of you. So whoever wants to take it, just raise your hand or just go for it. So often in the play, when characters are afraid, they put on this mask of aggression and hostility. Why have human beings evolved to not show vulnerability when vulnerability is the quickest passage to understanding, to compassion, and to a willingness to lean in and to hear what the other person has to say? I couldn't hear Suzanne until she got real and until she got honest. And then she had me. Why is that our last resort as human beings? Maybe you should start with that one, Hank, because you see it all the time.
Oh, gosh. I was trying to ask January on that one. So, gosh.
Either one of you.
Yeah, no, I to me, it's a measure of self-protection. I mean, I just see it that way as well. And trust. And really craving. The play is really the characters are craving for acknowledgement. So I think part of that is, and I do see that in business and in court, is when the first step towards successful negotiation is acknowledgement. And here the language said we're acknowledging you, but they weren't really acknowledged. And I think Don actually, it came a far way in this play too, where at the end he really had to make a decision, but he was still, I thought he made it as compassionately as he was capable of.
Mm-hmm. January, did you want to add? You're nodding.
I mean, we talked about this in the process, and the reality for Suzanne's character, from our perspective as this particular company, is she only becomes vulnerable when she humiliates herself by assuming that Karina's family is not full pay, and she completely exposes herself as the kind of person who thinks that way.
Even as she says, that's not who I am.
That's right. And so the only way that she can crawl back out of the hole of the depth of that humiliation, that's what activates in her the like ability to be vulnerable. I mean, Jonathan should probably weigh in, because I'm like, this is what, but for me, it's just born of need. It's in the way that we see Suzanne's character evolve through the play. I mean, she's a tactician. Mm-hmm. And in that moment, it's actually the smartest tactic that she can grasp to get herself out of this horrible, humiliating place that she's dug herself into. So I'm not entirely sure that the vulnerability that we see is not still, in a sense, just a mechanical response to the situation she finds herself in.
Jonathan, you created her.
I think it's that what she's doing with the choice to share that story. I think it's a place where different productions, different actors have made different choices about exactly what the degree is of manipulation that's involved in sort of the choice to share that story, or how much it's just sort of feeling out of control that it's sort of she goes to. And I think I think depending on the choice that's made, it colors the character in a different way. But I think all of the different. I think that the play hopefully is flexible enough to sort of to work with whatever choice that performer or that that production makes.
Mm-hmm. I would say it has.
And I would just add to that it's not the fact that she may still be using it as a tactic or manipulation does not in any way take away from the genuine pain and need. It is that sort of animal way that we have of responding to distress. So our animal brain and heart, it just gropes for the best thing to do. So the vulnerability can still be real, but it can also be beneficial. I think we have to kind of hold both of those ideas to sort of honor the humanity of the character.
Dr. Omer, I learned so much about the vaccination versus anti-vaccine controversy while trying to curate my guest list here tonight. And I could not be happier that all of you said yes. I had no idea it was such a hot topic, but friends told me that at the CDC, the few times that there are demonstrations that get really heated, they've all been around childhood vaccinations. And a couple of physicians said, good luck finding a physician who will come on and talk about this, because there is just a no-win situation. So A, thank you for saying yes. And B, why did you consent to joining in this conversation?
Well, so there are a couple of things. First, look, I like theater. I don't do theater, but I like theater. So that's one thing. The second thing was Atlanta. Like, so any email from a place that has sort of become a part of your identity is, obviously you open that email and read that email a little bit more carefully. The third thing is that if scientists and physicians and others do not communicate, that leaves a void that is filled by half-baked stuff. On the other hand, you're right. I have actually a subfolder. I'm not one of those people who put my emails nicely in different subfolders, but the only subfolder I actually curate is my quote-unquote fan mail. And that it can be very hateful. Sometimes, actually, it's true fan mail. It's older pediatricians that often write to me saying that these people haven't seen the diseases we have seen, etc. Some of them are nice, but we get pretty nasty emails, including threats of physical harm. And if you have a slight accent and you have a slightly different heritage, there's an additional zing to it, because they find one thing that is different about you, and they're built on that. And so it's not just anti-vaccine. It's not just that you support this vicious conspiracy by the pharma industry, that you are a bad person, and one time that you'll be lynched like Osama bin Laden. My first reaction was get your facts right. The guy wasn't lynched, but we have to sort of, that becomes part of that. And so when it's a deliberate decision. I'm not foolhardy, etc. For example, when I testify, I don't, there are certain precautions I take, etc. In terms of in front of legislature, states, or federal, and all of that stuff. But that's the cost of doing business. If you don't do it, then there's this void that's filled by all sorts of fluff.
When you say there are precautions you take, are you wearing a bulletproof vest? Do you have security?
There are others who do that, who've had to do that. Yes, so there is Dr. Paul Offit, who used to, when he used to come to CDC open meetings, vaccine meetings, he used to have a guard with him. I think it was one of the federal agencies protecting him, or the police or whatever. It was not a private guard, as I understand. Others have had other precautions, but basically, for example, if you where you enter the room from, etc., and how you behave, who you arrive with, you have to sort of take precautions, and that's cost of doing business.
Mm-hmm. Hank, have you found in your practice as a mediator and as an attorney and as a playwright that we have become less tolerant, that ad hominem attacks have become appropriate when we have, fundamental disagreements over a philosophy or over anything?
I do almost all my mediations are through the court system. So for me, the reality check is if you can't figure it out, you go to the judge. And I do, when I work in the courtrooms, I do see the judges still have authority, their marshals there. So I don't really see that in my professional life. Obviously, in personal and political life, it's just all over the place. When I tried to watch the debate, to me, it was just really one of the most depressing moments as someone who makes a living as a communicator. So I was just really disappointed with that. So I do see that more on the political level. And that's why I think that the play here is that whole Facebook exchange, again, was just phenomenal. It just, to me, it was just following that. There was so much to follow in that. I could watch that scene 3 or 4 times and just follow it different ways. So I do think that reflected it. And in mediation too, is you have the option of separating people, and that's a tool, and then just acknowledging, look, I hear your passion. It means a lot to you, but what is the end game? So to me, going to court, there's an end game. Either you're going to figure it out on your own, or the judge is going to make, as Abraham Lincoln says, the judge makes the last best guess. So we try to do that as well too. But to me, that's why in the communication here, there wasn't the structure. I think in political discourse, there isn't the structure for communication, and it just gets bogged down. So.
Jonathan, were those Facebook scenes, the social media scenes, fun to write, or were they painful to you to see how low we can go?
I mean, it was difficult to write. It was fun, but it was challenging. It was technically very challenging to write. And I think that the place that scene came out of is that I was spending as I was doing so much research, I would spend a lot of time, on message boards, sort of reading people arguing about vaccines, and the conversation would get so vicious and so awful. And I was feeling like there was no way to sort of have a play about this topic without reflecting that, which is so much a part of how the discourse happens. But I kind of didn't want to make any of the characters have to get that nasty with each other. So I was sort of trying to find a way to like bring, and also wanting to sort of broaden the conversation, since it was meant to be about the community as a whole, beyond and bring in the whole community. And then it's still, I think, a very technically challenging part of the play from a writing point of view, because if you're writing a scene, as happens sometimes in the play, where there are sort of 2 conversations happening simultaneously, you can time that out. But if you're trying to time out the comments, we read at a different pace than we speak. So figuring out what exactly, when the comments should appear is tricky. And then in performance, typically during that play, during that scene, there's a great deal of laughter, such that, in some productions you sort of can't hear much of the dialogue in the scene, which was not my intention, but is a sort of delightful accident. But then trying to figure out how to make it work so that the lines that are important to hear are still heard is a sort of separate technical challenge.
Yeah, as a viewer, I was trying to hear what the 4 people were saying as they were speaking over each other on the left side of the screen. And I'm trying to keep up with all the comments, and then I'm laughing. And so it really kept me on my toes as a viewer. January, under the best of circumstances, a director has to keep many spinning plates in the air, not having them crash, all these moving parts. So now, describe that process while in quarantine and having your actors in 5 different locations and you pulling all those pieces together. What was that like?
Well, most importantly, I have to acknowledge the 6th person, who is our stage manager, Courtney, who's actually running the show. So she's running the cues of the Facebook page and the comments and the sound, and taking the actors' cameras in and out and helping people problem solve with internet and things. So it really does not happen at all without that person. So congrats to her and the entire extraordinary cast. It's really similar, and I have the great gift of having a lot of my students here tonight, my wonderful students from my Theater 120 class at Emory University.
Hey, students.
They're amazing, amazingly talented, wonderful human beings. And I'm so used to doing this. I'm so used to doing theater on Zoom now because I've been doing it since March with my students. And so I've made certain accommodations about, as a director or a teacher, you have to just decide that anything that causes frustration or friction is not worth it.
Okay.
We'll get to that later. We'll go back and learn that lesson when we are back together. So you really actually have an opportunity to sort of pare the process down to the essentials, which in this case is what we can see and what we can hear.
Sounds like a good metaphor for mediation.
Perhaps it is, but it is a way to bring people together when we all just sort of agree these are the terms, what we can see and what we can hear, and how to think through the emotional arc of things. And it actually, I think, binds people together in a really nice way because we're all so starved for connection in so many ways.
Right, absolutely. All right, I'm going to invite you all to ask one another questions if you have any, and I'm going to check the chat to see if any questions are streaming in from our audience. I promised Courtney I would do that. And audience, please, we want to hear your comments. We want to see your questions. I don't see anything so far, but it could be my technology. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Omer? Any of you guys?
I can actually see one of my students.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious
for him.
Okay, I see a bunch of questions. Go ahead and ask your student's question, or does somebody have a question for Dr. Omer?
There is one specifically for him that I can see that says, Dr. Omer, in your experience in public health, how will the arts such as theater, TV, music, etc., play into helping build confidence in a COVID-19 vaccine when and if one becomes available?
That's a great question.
It's uncertain. But I think it could help, etc. For example, as someone who has been engaged with some work around the pandemic, going back to Camus' The Plague, the book that he wrote ages ago about this town in Algeria where there's an outbreak, I have gone back to that book a couple of times. I lost my copy. And in the move from Atlanta, so I reordered the book and I have gone back to it for a few times. So from a very selfish perspective, it helps to know, and you can see Dr. Fauci in that book, for example. Obviously, no character called Dr. Fauci, but there is a character that resembles the guy who is ostracized for telling the truth, the inconvenient truth, and so on and so forth. So yes, art helps. Art helps a lot at a very personal level for those of us who are in the thick of it, and many others are in the thick of it. But in terms of setting the narrative, I think if it's done right and if it's done subtly, it has to be helpful because a lot of the narrative from the places where we would hope mainstream messaging would come is not coming. So you would think, irrespective of the political party, people would talk some level of sense from their podium in the Rose Garden, and instead of hosting a super spreader event. So my hope is that if it is done right, if it's done appropriately, it will help. But I can't be certain.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jonathan, I have a question for you from Beverly. How different is this production from your initial version for the piece? And secondly, how has Zoom affected your view on rewriting? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite different because it's on Zoom and it's not a production. So we're not all in a theater together, watching it. And of course, the audience is a huge element to a play, certainly a play that is in part meant to be a comedy. I don't know what the experience of watching it is for sort of everyone at home. My experience of watching it is quite different than my experience of watching it, in a theater. I don't have any plans to rewrite anything, for Zoom, or certainly not this play. Hopefully, I'm trying to remain optimistic that our time in this format is somewhat limited, and at some point in the not too distant future, we will be able to return. This is actually the second Zoom reading that I've had of it. The first was with a cast of actors who had done the play before, so that was a little bit of a different experience because they were already so familiar with it.
Mm-hmm. All right, I have a question from Amna. I have a question about tech. Did the actors time themselves to match the chat during the live webinar scene, or was the chat cue based on their lines? This is where Courtney's genius really comes in. I got a headache trying to keep up with them. Never mind her doing all of her sound effects and emojis and et cetera, et cetera. January, you want to take that question?
Yeah, this is where we hit the hard wall of the limitations of Zoom. Because, in the theater, in the live theater, we have a lot of different people running all of these different things. And a stage manager cueing, a sound engineer and a lights person, and we don't have any of that. Courtney is a one-woman band. And so we actually spent about, maybe 3 or 4 hours today on that one scene, just trying to figure out how it could make sense. Who can cue whom when we can't make eye contact? Right. We can't necessarily hear each other. There's no secondary body language of any kind to rely on. And so just the fact that it happened was a miracle, and it was very exciting. And I stood up in my living room and applauded when the scene was over. But again, I will say, I'm not just saying that because Jonathan is here. It is the mark of a very sturdily, well-written, technically proficient play that it can withstand a little bit of wiggle room here and there in this type of format and still sustain the tension and the humor and the sort of engine behind it that we were able to do, because it was a lot of sort of like, okay, we're just gonna run at the wall and hope that it all turns out okay, and it really worked.
Beyond okay. All right, from Grace, a question for you, Dr. Omer. In your experience in public health, how will the art? Oh wait, January, you asked that question. All right, one from Marshall. At any time during production, did certain current events influence the contents of the play? Or perhaps did the actors find it easier to relate to / get into the characters due to current events? I wish we could have the actors weigh in on that. Who wants to take that question? Jonathan or January?
Yeah, I mean, I will say something I've been thinking about with this play and which I hopefully will have a life after COVID. But it's going to be such a different play after COVID than it was before. Like there's a way in which the play has sort of become a period piece because it so firmly exists in the pre-COVID world because it just the characters' experience of viruses and vaccines, I think exists in a place of naivete that I think we all wish we still had if we weren't going through this. So I think I'm very curious to see kind of how the play will land for people sort of on the other end, at the other end of this, when we hopefully are there. And I think it's so hard to know at this point what that's going to feel like, just for all of us as people, let alone then how plays will resonate with us in that time.
Jonathan, I see it a little differently. I see this play as being a precursor to what we're in for once the COVID vaccine comes about. Dr. Omer, you're nodding your head. So what do you think? Is Jonathan's play going to be a time capsule that's no longer relevant in 8, 12 months? Or is this where we're headed?
I wish that were the case. As a public health person, I think it has more longevity than a sort of a period piece of belonging to a recent past. I think we will. There's good things and bad things about vaccines. Vaccines will. First of all, we're not going to have a vaccine. I hope it's apparent to everyone before election, but we will have a vaccine program early next year, and that will ramp up throughout the year. Initially slowly, then a big peak, etc., or sort of big jump because that's how production and supply works of new vaccines. And then I've been asked a few times, what would be what would signal normalcy to you? And my answer has been being able to go to a jazz performance in the Village or in Atlanta, sort of to Blind Willie's, for example. One of the sort of the musical performances there, and to go to a play, because that would signify that we can safely gather as a group in small, reasonably confined, hopefully better ventilated There's better outbreak ventilation in all of those theaters, places. But the other thing those vaccines will bring back will be these debates. They're not, unfortunately, going away. And the nuance. And one of the things I would say, Jonathan, I really, really appreciate, as someone who's spent most of my professional lives on vaccines, I really appreciate that you didn't make a caricature out of, Chuzauzen. There are parents who have these kind, even without a backstory. It wasn't a sort of a one-dimensional character. And I often say the people on my side of the divide who are, there's nothing worse than the arrogance of self-righteousness that some of sort of my peers have. And if yelling at parents were a good idea, then teenagers would have been the best communicators around. And so I really appreciate that. But the fact that it will not go away, I think it will resonate with a lot of people. It will be a play that folks will remember and relate to.
Yes. All right. Let's see. Hank, I'll ask you this question from Jenny. It's really to everyone. What do you all think would have happened at the end if Karina also shared Suzanne's perspective on immunization? I don't see that happening, but what do you think, Hank, would have happened if Karina shared Suzanne's perspective on immunization by the end of the play? And if you're wrong, Jonathan, maybe she would. I don't know.
I'd probably answer this more as a playwright. I'd say, Jonathan, maybe you might want to consider writing that wonderful last scene. I mean, to me, Karina was such a fantastic. I mean, to me, all the characters had an arc in the play and were different at the end versus the beginning. But to me, Karina ended up being the most fascinating character. So to me, in some ways, I would look at it as a more of a dramaturg or playwright. Say, it would. But I think also too. I mean, I think the money, all the money. Eli is the one who subsidized the survivability of the school. Became really the linchpin of what ended up deciding this. So I think, to me, as a mediator, and even in this play, is to follow the money. I think that's where it would end up.
And then, as a playwright, Hank, going back to what you just said, what is it about Karina that you found so compelling and captivating?
She went from being, I mean, in the very first scene, she's sitting there. She's a really almost an accidental kind of hero, and then she's invited into this room at this school. And then at the end, she really takes the agency of just the petition, of trying to communicate. And she really is really, to me, does a role that Don is really charged to do, is to rally these folks. And so at the end of the day, a decision has to be made. I mean, that's the end game is, okay, what are the options? And I thought she pursued it with compassion, with information, but also acknowledging her own self-interest. I just, and the actress who did the role here was all the actors were phenomenal too, but I just could love the way that character evolved.
Jonathan, what did you want to convey in the first scene between Suzanne and Karina? I thought, gee, why is everyone so tense? They're both parents, they have kids in the same school, they're sitting in a safe space, let's say. So what is it that you wanted us to understand about these women from the get-go?
You mean the first time they're alone together on stage? Or
yes.
The first group scene?
The first time they're alone together on stage. They really have nothing to say to one another. And then we found out that they had, I guess Suzanne had hosted Karina at some kind of a school event, family event. And I just was wondering, what's the deal with this?
I think in some ways that scene, is structured a little bit like it's like a fractal version of the play at large, that it seems like a sort of moment of connection, or begins that way, or of welcoming, and then is that sense of safety is undermined a little bit, or sense of connection. So, but it's like you want to give them some kind of moment of being together on the same page about something, so that they have somewhere to go in the play.
January, where did you go in this play in terms of starting out with a certain point of view and then maybe evolving or experiencing an arc, or being confirmed that I knew I was right all along about this?
I would say that what changed the most for me over time and exposure to the play was my opinion of Chuzauzen. I grew to have a tremendous amount of empathy for her in the sense that, and this is sort of a bigger idea, and I think someone in the chat also asked about sort of the intersection of this vaccination issue and race. And I think there's something very interesting about, when you talk about risk tolerance, what people are willing to give up to see social justice, to see equity, right? She talks a lot about the community, and she even talks about, what kind of community do you want to be part of? Where is this book best used, in our home or in a school where many people can have it, right? And I've been thinking over the course of this year, what would I personally be willing to give up? If I knew that COVID could be cured tomorrow, back in May, if someone said to me, if you give up your life, no one will ever die of COVID again. No? What about a leg? What about one eye? What about someone you love? Your child? Like, at what point, ask me that question about curing racism, right? What would I be willing to personally give up if tomorrow, just like that, this thing could be cured for the community? And I look at her as someone who has decided very clearly what she is and is not willing to, what risk she is and is not willing to tolerate for the sake of a better world. Right. And I admire her clarity in a sense, because I think a lot of people pretend that they are more altruistic than they are, or that they would be, or that they would do anything. I would do anything to change this. No, I would give anything to change this. Oh, really? Let's go down the checklist.
Right. We're all like Chuzauzen in that sense. We would act one way, but we would claim, that's not who I am. Dr. Omer, I saw you nodding while January was talking about this arc in Karina's integrity, really. What were you thinking?
So no, I think Chuzauzen was a bit of a surprise, in a good way, etc. But the reason why I was nodding is actually, and if I can relate, personal experience. I've been part of the process both in the U.S. and for the World Health Organization to decide who gets the vaccine first. Wow. And what January was saying is that decision. And in a way, if you depersonalize this, it becomes a little bit more of a burden, because, if I were to, for example, if you asked me that if there is a challenge trial, for example, if you could speed up the vaccine development process where some people get vaccinated and then given a virus, it does reduce the time frame to do that. There is recruitment, and I've asked myself that question. Maybe I will go for this, but then I've said that maybe I would be more eager to go for it when my child is in college. So these kinds of thought experiments come to mind, that it is, in a way, altruism can be selfish as well. But so these kinds of things, but they take a different meaning in the middle of a pandemic, when you are saying that is opening schools more important than saving grandma who has lived her best life so far. And those decisions were made. And these are out there. What we did was we explicated the reasoning, both from the WHO side, but from the US side as well, that why we are saying that if you have only 3% vaccine, based on safety and efficacy, these kinds of things that Jonathan, that poll that you that you described so nicely, that gets magnified in a pandemic, and it's not easy, and you just hope that you did, and you make these decisions based on imperfect data, and one of the reasons is that your main public health agency has been muzzled. They can't release data, so you make these decisions and these recommendations based on imperfect data, and you just hope that what you have done is right. And so on and so forth. So that's why I was nodding.
Mm-hmm. Hank, Dr. Omer just talked about altruism as something that can be self-serving, and earlier Jonathan talked about vulnerability, or I think January brought it up at first, and Jonathan was thinking it as he wrote Chuzauzen, that she only became vulnerable when she needed and wanted something. Can you talk to that concept as a playwright, as an attorney, as a mediator? How can we be? Are we capable of true altruism as human beings?
I'm on the couple of. It's funny. I was watching this too as a board member of a couple of theater companies, and those negotiations really struck me. And I always say, when we have people on the board of an organization, I'm not really helped by volunteers who are doing it out of altruism. I want people who have some self-interest, who believe in the mission. It's at the core of their hearts and soul on this too. So and that's why, again, I thought Karina was such a fascinating character, because her self-interest was her son, and again, everything emanated from that. I don't think she would do anything destructive to the world. So yeah, I'm a great believer in self-interest as the best form of altruism, because if not, then the volunteers are going to disappear when something more crucial comes along. So that's why, to me, in our theater company, we try to make sure we pay all the talent at the best possible rate, because when we decide is, well, let's not do them a favor, but let's work for them, because they're going to pay me something that's going to help me get from today to tomorrow and paying the bills.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, Suzanne was very self-aware when it came right down to it, and she asks Karina, why do you send your child to private school? Suzanne understood, I want the best for my child. Of course, it would be best if we shared the resources, if we didn't hoard opportunities, but she was very frank about the fact that whatever is best for my kid, that's what I'm going for. Tell me about that character and how you crafted her, where she sprang from.
I don't know. I mean, this sort of thing. It's in that moment. I mean, I think in some ways that's also core to what the play is about. That there is just an inherent tension in these kind of places. These sort of which there are a number in the Bay Area. These sort of very progressive, private schools that have sort of social justice mission, but extremely high tuition and limited financial aid. And so there's just like, there's like a core contradiction, in the thing itself. But I think Suzanne is somewhat clear-eyed about that, and in that moment is just, is trying to sort of use, grasping for whatever tools she has, which is to try and take Karina's argument about there being a social justice aspect to immunizations, that we're sort of like taking on some risk for ourselves, to, making some sacrifice, which is the risk, to sort of help the community, and that, she's just trying to sort of turn that around
Right.
on her. But, I mean, I think it's, hopefully the play is structured in a way where you can, you can see it as, Karina's story, and it's kind of a sort of more like classical sort of hero's journey structure, or it could be Suzanne's story, and then it's kind of more of a tragedy, that she sort of has this hubris and like ends up losing the thing that she cares about the most. And I hopefully it works both ways.
Right. Dr. Omer, I'm curious, when meeting strangers, let's say you're at a cocktail party or you're on a flight, and someone asks, so what do you do? Do you ever shade the truth thinking, I don't want to get into this conversation or this potential battle? Or do you welcome conversations about vaccinations?
No, so surprisingly, people are okay with that. So if I'm asked, I don't flaunt it, but if I'm asked, I share that, I work on infectious diseases and my area is vaccines. But if someone is seeking out an argument, I don't get into that in that kind of a situation. And so that's kind of a social situation, because I do think, because having worked on that, we're actually running experiments on persuasion around that. So that, other than, as I said, in addition to doing vaccine trials and some of the basic, some of the epidemiological science work, we do these persuasion experiments as well. If it direct arguments and even myth correction can not only be ineffective, that it can actually backfire. So it's like a liberal watching Fox News or a conservative watching MSNBC. Their own views get hardened. And so that's why even in interpersonal connections, I actually avoid confronting directly. We use the approach of sometimes disease salience, so talk about the disease, not the vaccine. If someone has that kind of an approach, etc. Talk about values. So we did some work in around underlying values people have, and we found that vaccines decisions are actually moral decisions, and we can measure them, and values independent of vaccines. So people who are more libertarian and emphasize purity, irrespective of the, some people frame it as religious purity, others very secular. My body is a temple. The crunchy granola Whole Foods crowd. That kind of stuff. I shop at Whole Foods as well, so I'm not,
Yeah, that granola comment sounded a little judgmental, as Don would say. But I know what you mean.
So that kind of stuff. So what we are doing is we have run experiments there. They're speaking to, and I believe that's not my place to change anyone's values. The best I can do is to speak to their values. So this liberty framing, we've actually run that. In experiments, etc. So that's the kind of stuff that helps, and that's what I do in interpersonal connections as well. Mm-hmm. Not to directly confront, but sort of go from a side pathway to address some of this stuff.
Right. Okay. Let me see if there are any additional questions from our audience before we wrap up. All right, I like these kind of questions. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 no hope and 5 solid hope, how hopeful are the panelists that we as Americans are going to come through our current crisis a more perfect union? Jonathan, you got us into this mess.
I guess I'm curious if by current crisis do we mean specifically COVID, or do we mean the much greater crisis that we are mired in?
That question comes from Tom Key, the former artistic director. Hey, Tom, of Theatrical Outfit. So, Tom, if you want to weigh in, if you want to specify exactly what you mean by that question. In the meantime, if Tom is a typist like me, yes, go ahead, Dr. Omer.
I'm saying I think he may have meant this Sharknado of a year, a shark and tornado and everything coming together. Yeah. So I think we have more hope in terms of coming out of this from the pandemic perspective. It will be hard. Unfortunately, we're going to have, it's a cliche, but the winter is coming. And this is when the virus will naturally transmit more efficiently. So it has behaved as we had predicted, that it will not transmit, it will not go away in the summer, and it didn't, but it will have higher transmissibility in the winter, because that's how other coronaviruses behave. And we haven't done anything as a country to change that trajectory. It is in our hands to do this. Win or lose, whatever the outcome of the election, before January, we will not have, we shouldn't expect any change in course, etc. So that's, in the short run, the outlook is bad. But we will get through this. With a vaccine, grandma will be able to attend weddings, etc. Not right away, not in June, perhaps, but we will, if things go as we expect, and things are looking good in terms of from the technical side on the vaccine front. Certainly, I would watch this meeting tomorrow that FDA is having, an open meeting. If you are a sort of a science nerd, I would connect, because that will be the first time they will be presenting even preliminary data openly from phase 3 trials, etc. And so that will tell us a lot. But I think by the end of next year, we will have a lot of normalcy from the pandemic side. But again, as an immigrant, look, I have to be optimistic, etc. I came to this country. It was a bargain of values, not a passport. Some of us had choices. It was a very deliberate decision to say that, I will be a citizen of this country. And so this really bothers me. That the first act Trump did was to sideline and to go after people who have my kinds of names and my kind of heritage, etc. And so that's the kind of stuff that is more intractable. So the best thing we can do for public health and for democracy is go vote. and go vote in large numbers so that it's not only a marginal victory for one party versus another, it's a resounding message. So I'm more hopeful about the pandemic, the one in a 100-year event, but less optimistic, but still hoping for the best for one every 4-year event, which is the election.
Hank, tough to follow that one, but you're an attorney mediator, so I'm asking you, where are you on the scale of hope to no?
I think things will get worse before they get better, but they get better. And to me, that's what I love about theater. It's storytelling. The more we get to know each other, the more stories are being told. And I think this is really a chance for us in this country, in this world, to get to know each other. And so that's, to me, I'm leaning toward hope, like the doctor, but ready, gearing up for the winter.
Okay. January?
Oh, well, I'm a 5 for hope, which sounds, I know, a little bit, I don't know, Mary Poppins-ish of me, I guess. But the reality is that the more I read about our history, the more I know that there's nothing unique about this moment. There is nothing new about this moment. And to tell ourselves that there is something unique and new about this moment is to deny the fact that so many people have lived through it with so many fewer resources and so much less connection and so much less knowledge. So I can't negate their sacrifices and their experiences by saying there's no way we can get through this. I absolutely know we can. And that's why I'm interested that Tom said hope and not success. So I'm a 5 for hope, for sure.
All right, Jonathan, you have the last word.
I'm going to say like 3.5.
Okay.
I think we're in a moment of tremendous churn and change that will achieve a new equilibrium at some point that sustains for a while. And so the question is just like at a very basic level, like, is that new equilibrium one that enhances democracy and like the ability of people to vote and therefore to like determine the course of the country, or is that new equilibrium one that's much further in the other direction, that is stuck for a long time? And I'm holding on to hope that I don't know how long it will take, but that when we get there, it will be the first thing.
Excellent. Well, I cannot thank you all enough. I wish we could have done this in person, but this is by far the next best thing. I feel hopeful just knowing there are people like you out there in the world. January, you influencing young people. Jonathan, you putting your words out there. Hank, you guiding people through meditation, through mediation and so on. And Dr. Omer, your compassion, your knowledge as a scientist, but the complete lack of arrogance, the willing to explore all questions and all possibilities. I think this represents us, the best of humanity, and I'm so grateful that I got to have you all here tonight. Thank you so much for saying yes. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us, audience. You all stay safe too. Good night, everybody.